You might think that this is putting the cart in front of the horse, way in front of the horse. But here's what I'm doing. I'm taking out this cute but undersized steering wheel on the Quasi TI project and placing it with a more proper vintage series steering wheel that is significantly wider. And you might think there's very little to think about on these things. Maybe you don't. But here's the catch. The size of the steering wheel makes a tremendous difference in the steering input of the car. The smaller the wheel, the more force you have to apply to get the wheel to do what it is you're trying to get it to do. And if you're running the big, fat, grippy tires and you're muscling your car around the turns and you have one of those small steering wheels, your answer is within your problem. The bigger the wheel, the more torque you have in turning. Now, at high speeds, that really doesn't matter a whole heck of a lot, other than the fact that you will find yourself turning more with a smaller wheel than you will with a bigger wheel. The bigger the wheel, the more accurate you can be with your turning. Anyway, the reason I'm starting this side of the project right now is because this is a wheel that I'm planning on using. Correction, this is a wheel I'm going to use. This is a fantastic wheel that a friend of ours in the Netherlands sold us, and it is from 1970, so it is very much era correct for this car. Now, the reason I'm putting this on so far ahead of the game instead of worrying about everything else that this car needs right now, like I still need to resolve the power plant, we have fuel injection issues that we need to start designing. There's just a plethora of stuff that we have to do. But most of that stuff is in a holding pattern right now. But one thing I can be doing right now is building my Speedo collection, because we have the Speedo, the TAC, and the Tri-Gauge, just like in a real Super TI, or TI Super, however you prefer to say it. But we're using a set from the 64, 65 Giulia 101 style grouping. So, with that said, the steering wheel is going to be yay big, but I don't want to be looking around the wheel to see where my gauges are. So I have to fabricate that face. So in the sense of putting this wheel in, now I can lay out the gauges the way I need them to be able to see correctly their performance indicators and not have a whole lot of negotiating around a steering wheel. But again, the whole primary point of all this is that there's little nuances about your car that drive you nuts, and maybe it's how you're in a parking lot, you got those big fat grippy tires and you got to muscle the steering wheel to get out of the parking lot. If you have one of these 360 millimeter style steering wheels, this is a big reason why you have to muscle it. Not to mention these steering wheels are pretty fat around the rim. The car handles fairly elegant when you have an appropriate size tire. Now, I'm not saying you have to go to a really bicycle thin tire like the car came, but you can at least put a larger perimeter wheel on with a thinner rim, and you'll find the car is far more elegant to drive. Now keep in mind, if you're thinking like a true blue GTA type steering wheel, that may not be as fun as you think it is, because those wheels are flat dished and they bend, they move. It's a little scary. I've had a few of them in my time, and quite frankly, I had no reservations about selling them off to somebody else who'd rather have the look than the comfort and safety. So what I prefer is a slightly detinted wheel that puts a little rigidness in the steering wheel, and I don't have to worry about it bending like the GTA wheels did. Anyhow, with all said and done, I think that looks pretty cool. And now I can get a true sense of where my gauges are going to be. Okay, so today what we're going to do is Quasi TI is going to get a new set of front brakes. Now for most points and most considerations, the front brakes on these cars are pretty doggone good. They really are. However, very few of us still have 1600 motors in these cars. When we up the horsepower, we need to consider upping the ability to stop the car. That's kind of a golden rule in racing, and it applies to the street as well. Now, all things considered, the Aute brake is a really good brake. A great deal of our race cars are still on Autes. Now, but with that said, when you have a car that was originally designed at 1600, and then you put a 2-liter in it, and then you up the horsepower, the performance, the response, the overall car's condition and expectation of how it handles, the brakes cannot keep up with that. They just simply can't. Okay? And there's several different variations of modified brakes out there one can put on. You can put on the Volkswagen version of this. It was on the 70 series buses, which are bigger than this. Not a bad option. You can put on, there's aftermarket brakes out of Europe that come with big vented rotors and things of that nature. However, there is significant modifications you have to make to the car for those to actually work. When you see those big vented brakes, and I have them on my GT, there are sacrifices you have to make, and these are things you need to consider. One, you can't really run a booster with them. It's not advised. Two, you can't run the 22 mil brake master with it. You need to go down to a 20. So these are things that you have to consider. So if you go with those massive big brakes and the vented and the slots and the rotors, one, is a very expensive experience. Two, you have to modify the car's originality for those things to work. So with that said, there are other options out there. And what we're going to be looking at today, and we're putting on Quasi, and the reason we're putting these on these TI is for a couple significant reasons. One, Willwood makes a phenomenal product. Two, it doesn't require modifications of the car, which I really love that part. Three, I get to keep my booster, my master, and everything stays the same. Four, we're putting a pretty strong 2-liter in this car. A 2-liter that is going to have a lot of expectations, and with that upgrading in horsepower, you need to have upgradability in stopping that car. These are all outside the design parameters in which this car was originally designed. So you have to think a little bit further down the road. It's okay to have massive brakes if you can justify it. It's okay to upsize the brakes if you need them. And there are plenty of situations in which you will need those. The nice thing about a brake like the Willwoods is one, the pad surface is much bigger than these, and I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. Two, you can get variations of these pads. You can get pads that are ideal for track conditions. You can get pads that are ideal for street performance conditions. And that is something to consider. You can do the same thing with Autes, but you really kind of have to do your homework and find out where to get those and what the quality of them is. But one thing you don't get with Autes, you don't get a larger brake pad surface. Now the piston in the Aute is bigger than the Willwood, but you have two on a very focused point, whereas these you have four that are spreading that load. So you get better brake response, better brake feedback, so you can really get a sense of what your brakes are doing. It's just something that is significantly better than what the Autes were delivering. But one other thing that's a huge bonus we'll talk about immediately before we get going. These brakes don't weigh anything. This is a really lightweight cast aluminum, really well machined, fine execution on it. By a name you can trust, it's been around forever. So let's get going. Now, this is spring loaded, so when I pull this back out, I need to know that that spring's going to flop out, so you want to put a little pressure on it. See? Much safer. You don't have to go looking all over the place for it. These brakes are kind of hanging up anyway, so we have to use a tool to separate them. And there's the Aute pad. That's it. Again, for normal applications, normal power plants, that's not a bad way to go. But this brake is almost twice the length of this. I can't see a downside of that. Okay, so when Centerline turned me on to these brakes, I really didn't realize how much of an advantage this thing really would be, just in braking conditions. Something to consider. The difference in weight alone between the Willwood brake and the Ate, there's got to be at least 5-6 pounds difference. These are pretty brutal in weight compared to these. These are quite light. That is a unsprung weight gain in your favor. I mean, when you reduce the weight off the four corners of the car, right at the spring locations, and you can cut that unsprung weight down significantly, it is a characteristic that is a gain in performance and in the handling of the car. So anyway, the one thing that really needs to be talked about more than just about anything else is when we put these massive brake packages in, like the vented slotted ones that are out there, guess what? Most wheels, 14-inch wheels, won't fit them. So that's something you have to keep in consideration. So if you're going with the big brake packages, you have to start thinking that you have to go to the 15-inch wheel. If you like being told or dictated what wheel you end up using, so be it. The nice thing about these brakes is dimensionally they're so close to the Ates, just about every 14-inch wheel is going to fit underneath this and not giving any rubbing issues, to include the GTA wheels. And that's something really to consider, because it's a slippery slope that's not pointed out to you as you go down this whole brake improvement package. Again, for the most part, Ate brakes are going to do everything you would ever hope they would do for most cars. But as you up the performance of your car and as you up the expectations of your car's handling characteristics, things like the brakes need to be looked at and be somewhat critical of. So going to a brake with a much larger pad and a better conditioning pad surface that's not going to heat up the brakes and it's not going to burn off the brakes and it's not going to give you a bad pedal feedback, those are things you really need to be aware of. The nice thing about these Willwoods is you're going to get positive brake feedback, and that's a good thing. It's a nice thing to have and understand what your brakes are doing. But the closer is when you put these on, it's nice to know you don't have to go buy 15-inch wheels to get these to fit. That is something to know, because one thing is certain. I have the big brake package on my green GT, and the clearance on the big brake package to my original real magnesium GTA wheels is incredibly tight. Very, very tight. And that's something that kind of makes me wince a little bit about it. And I do have spacers so I can get those brakes to fit. With these, the application, the low-hanging fruit, the big coup de grace is that you'll be able to bolt these on and put your wheels back on, and you shouldn't have any issues. You should have plenty of clearance, and that is a big win. So in the event of trying to put in the Willwoods, what we didn't know until we got there was the brakes that are on Quasi are from an early Giulia. We've made no mysteries about it. The car is a bit of a bastard case. There's a lot of weird things that have transpired in that car's life that we're going to correct. Centerline has located us, and they're going to start inventorying more sheet metal parts, but they've gotten us a front clip for a Super, and we're going to be getting that soon, and that's going to be going on. The clock is ticking. This car has to be effectively ready and worthy of being able to drive from here to the historics in Monterey, down near LA, and back by August. So the little things that scare the hell out of me are the things that either we have to measure whether we need to deal with them now or wait till after the big event. But at the end of the day, one thing we can never compromise on is brakes. So because we had the smaller Ates from an early Giulia on the car, we have to convert. So we're putting in 2-liter spindles, and I'm now turning an old set, but a good set, of 2-liter rotors. One thing about the original rotors in these cars, make no mistake about it, they are of a high quality. They are most certainly usable if they're serviceable. Now what we've done, we've measured to make sure they're within tolerance, and now we're cutting them to make them right. So don't discard the old rotors if they look healthy to you. Measure them, cast it in there what the minimum tolerance is, and if they're serviceable, service them. If you don't use them now, fine, put them on a shelf. But effectively, don't discard them, because they don't make them that good anymore. There's some nice options out there, but they're not as good as the originals. Alright, so continuing with Quasi. Quasi is not what's living up to its name. It is definitely quasi. It's something it's supposed to be, but not really what it is. The entire front end of this car is nothing more than body filler. So today we're going to be doing the big job. I'm going to be taking off the front clip, and I'm going to show you kind of a process to do this. You know, this is something, if you have a welder and a little bit of forethought, you can do this yourself at home. You need to use what you have available to you. I'm not going to be pulling the hood off because I need to use that to orientate the front end. I'm not going to be taking anything that doesn't need to come off at this time, just simply so I can execute ideal alignments to the front end. And we're going to see how this goes. I don't know what I'm going to fall into. I do know down about here is over an inch thick in body filler. I do know that the core support is a bit knackered. I do know that the headlight bucket here is non-functional simply because of all this punched out. And I do know that the front fenders are bowed out a little bit, encroaching in on the tires a little bit. And what that has done, somebody has done an alignment on this car and set the wheels back a little bit to create some space or equalization around the fender. The reality of it, though, is the further back you bring the wheels, the more active the steering and the more ineffective the steering. So we are going to do a lot of things, but today our biggest focus is we are going to get this front clip off. We have a new front clip that just came in from Centerline, and we're going to put it in. The other thing is I don't like to make changes to a car that are irreversible, but in this case I'm going to have to. We are going to put the lower, we'll call them GTA cutouts, into the bottom of this, and this is why. We're going to upsize this radiator with a 3-row passage, but adding that coolant capacity is all fine and well, but if you don't have the ability to whip the coolant heat out, then it is all for naught. The reason we're doing that is because we're putting in a fairly aggressive but not overly aggressive 2-liter motor. When you upsize that displacement, you really need to consider upsizing the coolant capacity. Original 1600 radiators, quite frankly, don't cut it. And if you remember, we're taking this car to California on a very long, big trip, and there's going to be elevation changes, and it is aggressively hotter down there than it is up here in the Northwest. So, all things considered, we need to improve the coolant capacity. So, we're starting with the most obvious attempts. We'll put the GTA cutouts in on the new one, and we're going to do that with a little bit of a different touch because the clip is already here. You'll see what I'm talking about on that in a few minutes. But for now, I'm going to show you what that new clip looks like, and then we're going to talk about the differences between some suppliers of sheet metal versus others. Okay, so this is the new Super/TI front clip we just got in. I would say the number one question that we get asked is, where do you buy your sheet metal and why? Well, quite frankly, we buy our sheet metal from a few places. But, as I said before, you have to be somewhat careful because there's a lot of, let's call it, not Italian, not German, not Polish, not American stuff out there, and it shows. It's typically made out of far thinner steel. It's effectively made out of low quality steel, and it bends immensely easy, and they're not that accurately made. So we tend to be very picky about where we're getting our sheet metal. We've bounced around quite a bit, simply because some of our suppliers will go from quality stuff, and then they'll get in a batch of stuff that's not so good, and they'll sell it anyway instead of sending it back to whoever they're buying it from. So you tend to move around a little bit. You have to be careful. There's some repops out there that are not made in places that are known for good standards. I personally prefer the stuff that comes out of Poland. It tends to be a pretty high quality steel, and more importantly, it's really well accurately made. You typically know that stuff because it's got that light gray glossy primer effect to it. And it's not to take anything away from the Germans or the Italian stuff. It's all good, and it all works for me. However, like I said, there's some stuff out there right now that is not coming from those locations, and yikes, be careful what you wish for, because if you're not putting it in yourself and you're putting it in via a body shop or something, it could cost you a fortune simply because the stuff generally doesn't fit that well. It's generally low quality, and enough said on that, right? Anyway, another reason I'm bringing this up is a lot of people say, well, why are you getting stuff with Centerline? Well, quite frankly, the real reason is we're starting to do more and more business with Centerline because we're aligning ourselves with a local vendor, if you will. But the other reason why we're doing it is because Centerline has been incredibly conscientious about where they're buying their product. Yes, it tends to be maybe a little bit more than elsewhere, but at the end of the day, you're most likely going to get a higher quality product because the folks at Centerline have been paying attention to where the stuff is being made. I can't say that everybody does that. There's an awful lot of suppliers out there that are just getting it in. They don't care where it comes from. They're getting it out. It's for you to figure that one out. But anyway, here we are with a new clip. One, really well packaged. Can't tell you how many times I would get sheet metal in. It was just thrown in a box, an old bicycle box or something. Comes over here from overseas somewhere, and it's all beat up. And then we have to sit there and we have to do some metal work on it before we can even install it. And what sucks about that is somebody has to pay for that, and that's a bit of a travesty. One thing for certain, the person who's not going to pay for it is the person who bought it from. And obviously, if it's from overseas, we have to ship it back. There's a substantial shipping price that would be associated with it. At the end of the day, you just end up start metal finishing because it's technically cheaper and easier. Now, one thing to be said about these reproduction parts, they tend to be made off of the most current molds available. Now, this would be from a 70s series TI Super. And it worked pretty well. There's some changes to it that don't line up with what we're doing. One of them is these. Those didn't exist in a 65 Ti. But we're putting in the GTA holes, so I'm going to use this to my advantage. And I'll show you where we're going with that in a minute. We are not running inner headlights on this car. Instead, we're using these. The reason we're using these is because I'm going to fuel injection, and I'm going to need a lot of air over the throttle bodies. This is going to give me that provision that I need. If you notice, taper funneled effect, and it's going to go and shoot air right at the injector system. I'm happy about that. But you notice the size of these square holes? Those come in many different sizes when you look for stainless steel mesh. So you have to pay attention. And it's basically the how many squares per inch. This is 4 squares per inch. So when you go shopping for mesh, this is 4 squares per inch. So this and this are relatively the same. Yes, it's an aesthetics thing, but it's something that stands out if you get it wrong. If I were to run the 8 mesh, that would be 8 squares per inch, it's going to stand out that it's not the same, and that doesn't work for me. So we bought this to match this on that. So it's one of the things, if you're doing things like this, it's those little detail things that you should probably map out before you buy stuff, because this isn't cheap. This is effectively about $40, with shipping to get. You can buy them out of any given race catalog, but just pay attention to the sizing, especially if you're running something like this. The other thing is you don't want too fine a mesh. The reason you don't want too fine a mesh is because mesh is somewhat restrictive. If I cut out the holes in the bottom and I put, let's say, a 8 or a 16 holes per square inch, that's fairly restrictive stuff, and it kind of almost defeats the process, because when you think about it, when air hits mesh, it kind of spreads, and if it spreads, it creates what's called static buildup. And if you create enough static buildup, the air going through the mesh is not nearly as efficient as you think it is. So 4 holes per square inch is what we use. Anyway, let's get started. Okay, so I'm just mocking up the grill just to see where any of my deficiencies are going to be. And one thing about it, though I have made no cuts yet, I've just removed the hardware that was in my way. I can see how badly this is pushed in. There's some really bad welds here. Lots of bad welds in here and on the other side. It's to be expected because it's obvious that this car had a significant front end smack. And there's going to be, over the years, not today, there's going to be a lot of reworking I will do on this car in time. But for now, the reason I have it on the frame rack is because at some point in time I'm going to have to pull this front end to make things right. But I'm going to alleviate that tension for now. I'm going to get rid of the core support and start removing dead metal that's in my way. And what you're going to see shortly, because you can't see it right now, is how thick the body filler is on this car. Is it worth it? Oh, absolutely. It's definitely worth it. More so it's worth it because it's in my shop and I control my own hours on it, if you will. I can pay myself effectively to fix it. But it's just one of those things. When you're buying one of these, look it over thoroughly and weigh the odds. Are you willing to spend what it takes to make it right? In my case, in this situation, it's a no-brainer. All right, so here's your first step. You see how thick that is? That is no less than a ½ inch of body filler. And it's really a damn shame because the metal itself looked like it was in good shape. It just needed somebody to take a little time and bang the metal flat instead of loading it with filler. That's a damn shame. Okay, so this is the preliminary cutout. At this point we'll fit the replacement piece, but by no means is it ready to go in. We have lots of prep work to do. Most importantly, look at all this. This is just absolutely destroyed. Tons and tons of body filler on this car. Thank God whoever was putting this together didn't know how to weld very well because most of the welds snapped right off. So the good news is the core support, it's in fairly good shape and I'm happy about that. Bad news is lots of work needs to be done there, but that's okay. The whole front end needs to be pulled out anyway. And yeah, that's about that. Now, a lot of you are probably going, well, why is the radiator still there? Why is the air intake still there? Well, the reason it's there is because they're excellent reference points. The whole point of doing all this was so I can get proper headlight alignment on these, and I can also put in my cool air intakes. So when I have the snout, which you notice is plugged, I have the snout for the intake over here, I can really get my geometry exactly where I want it, because there is going to be some mods. Whether this needed to happen or not, I was going to have to modify this a little bit for my air intake. So, you know, this way it makes everything easy, and I know that when I go to put everything back on, I'm already going to be aligned. And, you know, inevitably I got to pull the motor and everything out of this anyhow, so we're just in that process. Now effectively, if the bumper mounts are not distorted, which this one is, but if they weren't, that's where I would center everything and make everything come to it. Now the two sides, the only one that's really damaged quite badly is this side. And as you see, I'm not even close. So that gives me a good idea of where I need to be when I start pulling things. Not too far off here, which that's fine. That's going to come along pretty well. All I got to do is address that mostly. Okay, so there's so much body filler on this car, it's kind of hard to figure out where seams are at and where bad welding was done. So I'm kind of slowly removing the layers and exposing what I need to before I start mocking up the other piece. It's not the worst, but it's not the best either. Anyway, so I banged back some of this walling for now. I got a lot of work here to do, but I just banged it back to create some of the shaping and stopping. I pulled the bumper mount back into place so I can get a general fit that will actually accommodate finalizing the approach on that clip. But as you see, This is where the two folds meet, coming from the fender to the rear clip, and they fold up and behind, and there's a seam there. Well, that seam's been smacked over, and then a lot of body filler, and the thing I hate the most, a lot of brass welding was done. So that tells you this was probably done back in the 80s or somewhere in that timeline, because we haven't used brass welding in a long time. But anyhow, also, near as I can tell, this car's probably been in at least 2 different fender benders. So we're gonna make it right, because a couple things. One, it's my car. 2, I just hate the idea of having a bunch of body filler as the answer. Okay, so I pushed back everything over here, got it over. I'm gotten where this wall's lining up quite well. But again, your bumper mounts are pretty much where they're supposed to be. That is a great place to use as your consistent location points. So I'm going to put one there. Okay, so we got one location point there, and now I'll put the other one in. And now we're going to start checking the hood alignment. Okay, and this is where the value of leaving everything in place comes in. The hood comes down, drops into the striker just like it should. The radiator comes right up to the location points on the back side of this, just like it should. By taking all those things out, we will be guessing if we're okay or not. But it's coming along quite well. This side over here is almost ready to go now. This side over here, however, is way far off. That fender is pushed back and it's short, so we're going to pull it in order to get it close. But it's coming along pretty well. I'm going to call this a stopping point for the day. The new metal's in place. It's not permanent yet because I still need to work this fender. But the new metal's in place. The expanded air for the radiators in. And now you can see why it was so relevant to get this mesh match this mesh. It just promotes that symmetry, and it's just that smart touch. Makes everything look a little bit better. Essentially, this is just where we're going to stop for the day, but I think you can agree this is a significant improvement for a matter of just a few hours of work.